The movie begins in Tikrit during the Iraq War, where an American military squad is stationed at a checkpoint. Suddenly, a speeding car approaches from a distance, with its occupants firing shots. The attackers are revealed to be a group of Iraqi rebels who break through the checkpoint and continue shooting. The leader in command, Sergeant Brandon, orders his soldiers to pursue the assailants. An intense chase then unfolds, with the soldiers firing at the rebels throughout the town streets. They eventually arrive at an alley, unaware of the potential dangers that lie ahead. The squad exits their vehicle and cautiously moves toward the alley. Soon, the rebels launch an attack from the rooftops, which leads to a deadly gunfight between the two groups. During this, a rocket-propelled grenade strikes one of their jeeps and tragically claims the lives of 2 soldiers. The rebels then hurl another grenade from the rooftops, which blows up on a civilian's vehicle. One of the soldiers, Tommy, happens to be near the vehicle during the blast. Another soldier named Rico selflessly dives onto Tommy to shield him. Unfortunately, this act of bravery leaves him severely injured with burns throughout his body. Brandon rushes to check on Rico while the rest of the squad provides cover fire. He quickly moves the injured soldier into a nearby alley to shield him from further attacks. Moments later, another soldier named Preacher is struck by enemy gunfire, causing severe wounds to his neck and jaw. His best friend Tommy rushes to him, but Preacher tragically passes away in his arms. Meanwhile, the rebels continue their onslaught of gunfire, and Sergeant Steve chases one of them into a house. Brandon soon learns that his longtime friend Steve has been wounded, so he hurries inside the house to help him. There, he comes across several dead men, women, and children, with their blood spattered all around. He helps an injured Steve get out of the house before the situation escalates further. The ambush results in the deaths of 3 U.S. Army soldiers, while 1 is critically injured. Following this harrowing experience, Brandon and his fellow soldier return home to their small Texas town. They receive a warm welcome from the community, followed by a parade. However, the only thing truly worth celebrating is their survival. In the next scene, the soldiers attend a small welcome party at a local pub, surrounded by family and friends. A drunken Steve begins recounting the brutal combat they faced during the war. This clearly makes others uncomfortable, though he remains oblivious. He goes on to share his desire to join the sniping team and use it to avenge their fallen comrades by taking down the Iraqi rebels. That night, Brandon receives a call from Michelle, who happens to be his childhood friend and now Steve's fiancée. Sensing her distress over the call, he quickly drives to their house and finds Steve digging a hole in the front yard. Brandon tries to talk to him, but he can't get through. Steve, lost in his thoughts, continues digging, as if they're on a mission in the war zone. It becomes clear that he's having a mental breakdown, likely due to PTSD from the war. Shortly after, Brandon heads inside the house to talk to Michelle. Shockingly, he finds the place in disarray. Michelle then explains that Steve, in a drunken state, started believing that enemies were attacking him. He then ransacked the entire house and started digging a hole outside. Just then, Brandon notices a bruise on Michelle's face. She tearfully reveals that Steve accidentally struck her during his drunken outburst. As they talk, they notice Steve falling asleep in the hole outside, still holding a gun in his hand. Moments later, Tommy arrives at their house, slamming his car into a tree. Brandon then approaches him, and a visibly intoxicated Tommy reveals that his wife Jeannie has kicked him out because of his drinking problems. He then confides in Brandon that he plans to stay at their cabin outside of town for a few days. Brandon also sympathizes with him and suggests that the rest of the squad join him at the cabin to take some time off and relax. The next morning, the soldiers spend their time at the cabin drinking. Tommy amuses himself by shooting down his wedding gifts, while their friend Shorty reads the gift cards aloud. A hungover Steve is suddenly startled awake by the gunshots. The rest of the squad laugh as he stumbles out of the car trunk in confusion and hastily gets dressed. They then watch quietly as Steve takes aim at the gift from him and Michelle and shoots it down. Later that evening, Brandon pulls Steve aside for a private conversation and asks about a bruise on his face. Steve initially brushes it off and claims he walked into a door. However, Brandon sees through his lie and directly confronts him about hitting Michelle. Caught off guard, Steve confesses that he doesn't remember the violent incident. He admits to blacking out sometime after their pub party and waking up suddenly in the trunk of Tommy's car. Despite this, Brandon sternly warns him that such behavior cannot be repeated. The following day, the squad returns to their military bases. Brandon anticipates being discharged from duty and advises Tommy to lead the recruits. To his dismay, he receives orders to be deployed back to war-torn Iraq. Brandon finds it difficult to accept his fate since he's still struggling to cope with the recent loss of his comrades. Infuriated, Brandon confronts his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Boot, about the order. Boot explains that the directive is based on the military's stop-loss policy. This policy requires soldiers to return to duty even after their active commitment has ended. Hearing this, Brandon openly criticizes the president, sparking a heated argument between him and Boot. Growing increasingly furious, Boot reminds Brandon of his responsibilities as the squad leader and the necessity to follow orders. When he refuses to comply, Boot accuses him of disobeying a direct order from his superiors. He then orders his men to confine Brandon in military prison until his redeployment. Shortly after, Brandon is escorted by 2 soldiers towards the prison, but he fiercely resists and manages to break free. He then drives away hastily from the base before stopping somewhere along the road to call Steve. He recounts the entire ordeal and explains his decision to go AWOL after discovering he's been redeployed to Iraq. Steve cautions Brandon against this risky move and suggests seeking help from Boot. Brandon, however, reveals Boot's intention to punish him and insists on his plan to evade capture. Steve reassures Brandon and promises to help him find a solution. Upon returning home, Brandon finds the town sheriff waiting there. The sheriff informs Brandon's parents about his AWOL status and reveals that Boot has personally ordered a statewide search for him. The sheriff urges his parents to advise Brandon to surrender and take responsibility for his actions. After the sheriff leaves, Brandon sits down with his parents and Michelle and explains the entire situation. He then proposes taking the matter to a senator, but his father warns about the consequences of violating the chain of command. Undeterred, Brandon decides to drive to Washington, D.C. to address the issue himself. Due to surveillance by the military on their family, Michelle volunteers to drive with him instead. During their journey, they stop and book a hotel for the night. While Brandon relaxes by the pool, he suddenly imagines someone drowning and instinctively jumps in to rescue them, only to realize it was a hallucination brought on by the stress of their situation. The next morning, Brandon and Michelle hide as police officers arrive looking for them. Meanwhile, Tommy pleads with Boot for another chance and promises to improve as a soldier. Steve then calls Brandon and informs him that he spent the night at the jail trying to bail Tommy out of a DUI charge. He goes on to express frustration that Brandon, as their squad leader, isn't present to handle such matters. Just then, Brandon tells Steve that he's heading to Washington, D.C. to meet with the senator. Steve becomes even more furious, concerned for both his safety and Michelle's well-being. Brandon then promises to drop her off before crossing the state line and reassures him that he'll return quickly. Later that night, Brandon and Michelle visit Preacher's family. Preacher was one of the soldiers under Brandon's command killed in the alley ambush. Brandon recounts the harrowing details of the ambush. Despite this, Preacher's parents express their gratitude that Brandon made the effort to visit them and check in. When Brandon and Michelle return to their car, they find that the window has been smashed. Brandon instructs Michelle to wait for him while he tracks down the culprits in an alley. As he confronts the men, they attack Brandon and one of them draws a gun. Despite the odds, Brandon manages to disarm the assailant and forces all of them to kneel as if preparing to execute them. Just as Brandon is about to shoot, Michelle intervenes. She then persuades him to stop and leave with her, and Brandon reluctantly agrees. Afterward, they get a hotel room nearby where Brandon meets with another AWOL soldier. He reveals that the senator will be of no help and goes on to explain the struggles of being on the run. He then suggests a lawyer who can help him arrange forged discharge documents. He also explains that Brendan could establish a new identity in Canada, which would significantly ease his life as a fugitive. The next morning, Steve visits them at the hotel, having learned about their whereabouts from Michelle. He arrives in uniform to take Brandon back. He then informs him that he has struck a deal with Boot. All charges against Brandon will be dropped if he returns to the base within 14 hours. Brandon becomes enraged, accusing Steve of making decisions behind his back. It is then revealed that Steve volunteered to return to Iraq and has re-enlisted himself. Michelle is furious and questions Steve's commitment to their relationship and their plans to marry. He reassures her that they will still get married once he returns from his mission. However, she remains silent, feeling hurt by Steve's decisions. Ultimately, she decides to end their relationship, unable to move past his betrayal and lack of communication. Shortly after, the two men step outside, where Steve reveals Tommy's ongoing struggle with alcoholism. He tries to persuade Brandon to return to duty with him. He emphasizes that the squad only respects Brandon as their leader. However, Brandon remains adamant in his decision and emphasizes the flawed nature of the war. Steve bluntly reminds him of the harsh reality: the senator won't help him because he's AWOL. Later on, Brandon calls the senator's office, but is informed that the senator refuses to meet with him since he's considered a fugitive now. Meanwhile, Steve catches up with Tommy, who is heavily intoxicated again. He insists he's going to see his wife, Jeannie, but Steve tries to stop him. Tommy fires back, claiming he shouldn't be offering advice on relationships. This leaves Steve walking away in frustration. Following this, Brandon and Michelle visit Rico, a soldier who bravely rescued Tommy during the ambush in Iraq. Rico shares the devastating extent of his injuries. He has lost his right arm and leg, his eyesight, and suffers from severe facial burns due to the explosion. During their conversation, Rico recounts the horrific situation in the hospital, which is filled with the screams and nightmares of war veterans. Despite everything, Rico remains thankful that he survived and is no longer in the war zone. Later on, Brandon opens up to Michelle about the chaos and uncertainty of the battlefield. He goes on to share his guilt and trauma over the deaths of his fellow soldiers. He also opens up about his guilt for accidentally taking the lives of several innocent Iraqi civilians. Shortly after, Brandon contacts the lawyer recommended by the other AWOL soldier. The lawyer instructs him to meet at a diner with $1,000. Therefore, Brandon and Michelle sell their car and exchange it for a bike to gather the required amount. At the diner, the lawyer informs them that there's no turning back after this point. He then hands Brandon a new set of identification documents and gives him a phone number to call. The lawyer explains that once he calls the number, someone will arrange to pick him up at his new destination. Following this, Brandon calls his mom and learns the devastating news that Tommy has taken his own life at the forest cabin. During the funeral service, Brandon visits Tommy's grave to pay his respects after everyone has left. Soon after, Steve also arrives and confronts Brandon. He blames himself for leaving and not being there for Tommy. They end up in a physical altercation as they both struggle with their grief and anger. The brawl eventually ends with Brandon walking away from the scene, leaving Steve to break down in tears. A few days later, Brandon bids farewell to his father and leaves with his mother and Michelle. Together, they drive him towards the Mexican border in order to help him start a new life on the down low. As they approach the border, Brandon struggles with the realization that leaving everything he's known won't fix his inner turmoil. He decides against crossing into Mexico, believing he can't truly leave the war behind by escaping it. Later, Michelle joins Brandon's parents and they arrive to say their goodbyes. The movie comes to an end as Brandon, along with Steve and other soldiers, prepares to deploy to another war zone.